There and welcome to our webinar on furthering financial resilience and the important role of investments. My name is Tracy Bird and I run SCVO's Trustee Network, which is sponsored by CCLA, who are the UK's largest charity fund manager. So thank you for coming along today, and while people are still joining us, do take the time to introduce yourselves in the chat and maybe tell us a bit about your thoughts about where investments sit in your organisation, because I think we'd find that very interesting. Just to note, we've got closed captions enabled today, but you can turn them off at the bottom of the screen. And as you've just heard, we're recording the presentation part of the session, but we won't record the questions afterwards. But if you do have any particularly confidential or sensitive issues you would like to discuss with ourselves or with Celia from CCLA, and you'd rather not do that in this session, you can get in touch afterwards. We will send out all the slides to you afterwards in a follow-up email, but do put any questions you'd like to ask in the chat, and we can look at those as we go through or at the end as well. So today, I'm delighted to be joined by Celia Waring, who is Investment Director at CCLA, and they're a great source of support for SCVO right across our organisation. Celia's got a wealth of investment experience and has also worked in our sector, and I'm delighted she's going to take us through how charities can optimise their assets to support greater financial resilience. I'm now just going to hand over to you, Celia, for your presentation. So as I say, keep the questions coming in the chat and we will get to them. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Tracy, and a very good afternoon to all of you. I'm going to share my screen and now can I just check you can see?
Yes, they look good. Thanks, Celia.
Tracy was asking me ahead of this call what the artwork was. CCLA have a partnership with the Kersler Trust, who do art in prisons, and then they sell it and give the artist the proceeds on release. And I thought this one, of all of the options, this one sort of felt like the strongest link to creating strength and financial resilience. So that's what that's from. But it's really nice to be here. My name's Celia and I'm the investment director for Scotland for CCLA. I'm based here in Edinburgh. And before becoming an investment manager, I was actually a fundraiser in the charity sector. So I've moved to the dark side, as people might say, although perhaps the lightest grey of the dark side, because CCLA is a specialist investment manager for charities. But having come with that fundraiser background, I do understand some of the challenges you might be facing from trying to build financial resilience. I also recognise I'm standing in between perhaps you and lunch, or I'm catching you at the worst moment of the day, just after your lunch. So I'm going to try and make this as sort of lively and interactive with lots of time for Q&A. So what are we going to cover? We're going to look at what we mean by financial resilience and what does it mean for your organisation. We've got a range of different organisations on the call today. There'll be some for whom financial resilience means just making it through the next 6 to 12 months and maybe even managed completion or closure. For others, it might mean building on existing policies or plans and strategies. There'll be some on the call for whom the idea of investments seems a million miles away, and for others it'll be really familiar. For those in the maybe the kind of my charity is too small for investments camp, there'll still be lots for you to consider on today's call. So we're going to look at both short-term reserves and long-term investments that can both support financial resilience within your organisation. So short-term reserves, where can you generate the best returns on your cash that still needs to be accessible and flexible? Are the banks sharing the heightened rates of interest rates with you? Spoiler alert, no, they're not. Expectations for interest rates. If interest rates are coming down, is it still worth doing anything different with your cash? Another spoiler alert, yes, it is. And then long-term reserves, what are the greatest risks? And what are the risks that are most relevant to you, to your organisation, and to your objectives? we'll dive in. So the Chartered Institute of Public Finance and Accounting define financial resilience as the ability from a financial perspective to respond to changes in delivery or demand without placing the organisation at risk of financial failure. And they go on to say that this basically means you've got to have the agility and the flexibility to both forecast and manage how much you're spending and how much income you're receiving to meet requirements as they change and delivering a balanced budget. And that all sounds wonderfully simple and straightforward, but the reality is it's much more messy than that, and especially when you're a small organization. I know we have some on the call today. So I think from our perspective, financial resilience means looking at your income and your outgoings and just seeing if there's any way to build a buffer or some reserves that can give you even a small amount of flexibility or resilience in the face of change or crisis. Now, I'm sure the experience of managing or coping during COVID remains very vividly in your minds. And one exercise you could consider is asking yourself, if you had that time again, and God forbid, but if you had that time again, is there anything you would have done differently in your organization? Could you have been better prepared? Maybe the answer is no, but it's worth sort of going through that process and asking yourselves those questions. If you had policies in place, did they actually guide you in that scenario? Did you have good communication between the board, the executive, the fundraisers? And all of these things speak to the key tenets of building financial resilience. So regardless of your size, your income, your future expectations, there are some universal elements that can support financial resilience. So the first is good governance, which is another very easy thing to say. But I think the fact that you're all on this call highlights that you're applying good governance to building financial resilience. In our experience at CCLA, working with thousands of charities, great and small, good governance is all about asking yourselves the difficult questions, getting guidance, making plans, putting policies in place, and being willing to test and adjust over time as your situation changes. So in building a financial plan, you would want to include your income expectations as much as you can, voluntary income, grants, government contract, funding, investment income, etc. Your likely expenditure, again, likely, understanding that it's likely to change. Your reserves, do you have a short-term reserve, long-term reserve? And if you're in a more uncertain situation, this plan could also include how you might reach completion or the end of your work and who might help you at that point. And then to support that plan, you might have policies in place. Again, regardless of your size, you can still put reserves or investment policies in place to support future proofing and future planning. So, for example, you could have a policy that suggests how much should be kept as a short-term, easily accessible cash reserve, maybe an operational reserve, so it needs to cover 3-6 months of operating costs if your income streams were to stop. You could have an investment policy that covers short-term reserves and longer-term ambitions. Again, you don't have to be a large organization to have long-term investments. You can start with £1,000. So this is not for the preserve for only wealthy charities. You could have in your policy an example like we aim to put X% or a small sum to be allocated for longer term reserves, and we're going to add to it each month or each quarter so that you're slowly building up a reserve over time, and you're setting out in the policy your ambitions to do that. I can provide templates and guides to writing policies. So if that's helpful, please get in touch after this and I can provide those, or I can share them via Tracy. Internal communication and alignment, really important. And I'm sure you will instinctively know this, but everyone needs to agree on the plans and the policies and be clear on expectations. So the executive, the finance team, the fundraisers, the board of trustees. And one example, or one test for yourselves that might sort of check some of these theories is if your charity received a transformational donation tomorrow, if someone came along and gave you £1 million, do you think that the board and the executive would all be agreed on how that money should be spent and how it might be used to support financial resilience. It's just an example of a test that you could apply in conversation with your board about, how would you like to build financial resilience, and are you all agreed? There's also support for policy development from Oscar. They've recently updated their guide for investors, and there are loads of helpful pointers for long-term investors, short-term investors. They have specific guidance for small investors. So do have a look there for guidance. Now, before I go on to looking at short-term and long-term investments that can support your financial resilience, are there any immediate questions in the chat or that people want to raise?
There's nothing in the chat other than yes, please, to templates and guides. So we will arrange that. We'll get that sent out with the follow-up email. But does anyone want to come off mute and ask a quick question, or are you happy for Celia to continue?
There'll be time at the end as well, but if there are any immediate questions, do fire away.
Don't think so. Nobody's got their hand up. So yeah, we'll do that at the end. Thanks,
Okay,
Celia.
great. So I wasn't going to spend too much time today on exactly what your plan or your policies should look like, because obviously they'll be very unique to your organization. But I want to just move on to looking at different types of investments and how they might support your plans over time. So charities with huge endowments or significant investments will still have cash reserves. And of course, a number of charities on the call today will not have long-term investments, but their cash reserves are really important. And what you do with that cash is also really important. And of course, there are lots of obvious benefits to holding cash. It offers you certainty and security. A pound is a pound when you need it. It offers liquidity. You can get at it when you need it. And of course, it offers yield, if you can get it, in the form of interest. But are you getting enough interest on your cash? And I suspect for some of you, the answer might be no. And part of that is a sort of historic legacy. If you cast your mind back to 2010, and really 2010 to 2021, we all became very accustomed to essentially no interest, or very little interest. And we had interest rates reaching as low as 0.1 during the height of the pandemic. And so charity trustees and finance directors and board members, there wasn't really much choice when it came to cash. And it certainly wasn't really supporting financial resilience, apart from the fact that you might have a sort of a ring-fenced reserve. But as the pandemic ended and we were all let out again, inflation took off, made worse by the war in Ukraine, sadly, and interest rates shot up, as you can see in this chart, from sort of 2022 onwards, to try and control that inflation. That made our mortgages and loans much more expensive. But on the flip side, it suddenly offered a more attractive rate on our cash. Interest rates are now falling back down, as you can see in this chart. This is the expectation for interest rates. And this was done back in October, but broadly the consensus is interest rates are coming down, but pretty slowly. So, we've got a very uncertain economic outlook, no thanks to Donald Trump and tariffs. And actually, that Donald Trump and tariffs are likely to be inflationary, which further makes the case for interest rates being higher for longer. So actually, in some modest ways, that's good news for charities with cash reserves, if you can get that interest. And of course, the banks are not renowned for their generosity when it comes to passing on that interest to you, the investor, or the cash holder, the account holder. So if you look at this chart, in 2004, banks paid forward 90% of the official rate, the base rate, to depositors. So actually, interest rates at that time were between 4% and 5%, roughly where we are today. So you could get quite a decent return from your cash in the bank. But if you look further to the right, in 2024, banks are only sharing 40%, and many of them less than that. The banks are not hungry for your cash. They're just not going to entice you with higher rates. And I suspect if we did a straw poll with the charities in this room, what are you getting on your cash in the bank? you know, I suspect there'll be people who might be getting less than 1%. So what can you do? Is there any hope? Well, the answer is yes. There are a few different things that you can do with your cash to maximize the returns that you get on your cash to further support resilience. So, and of course, there might be a role for more than one of these in your sort of plans and strategies. So I'll just sort of whip through them. So on the left, the first, the good old bank account. So everyone needs a bank account. It gives you instant access. It gives you banking services, immediate payments. You can pay staff, you can make transfers. They are essential. But the downside, as we just talked about, the interest rate is pretty low. On top of that, you're only covered by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme up to £85,000. So if the bank were to collapse, you'd only recover £85,000 back. So of course, you could spread your cash across, if you've got more than £85,000, you could spread that across multiple accounts. But our experience working with lots of charities has shown us that even opening one bank account is a complete nightmare for charities, let alone multiple, and the administrative burden would just be immense. So bank accounts have a role, pros and cons. You've then got term deposits offered by the banks. So potentially higher rates on offer, but you need to lock your money up. So you'd need to put it with the bank for 3 months, 6 months, 9 months, and so on. So not very flexible and hefty penalties if you need your money back, but you could get a higher rate of interest than you can on your current account. There's then a third option called money market funds. And this is where investors pool their cash and have it managed within a fund. So it's not a bank account. So you don't get the banking services like instant access and immediate payments and things like that. But you can have liquidity. So it can be daily dealing. You can get security through diversification. So within the fund, you know, the money will be spread across lots of different banking institutions, and it will likely pay a higher rate of interest. So just to give you an example, this is going back to the chart I just showed you, the Bank of England's official rate or the base rate over time. And then the blue line is CCLA's deposit fund. Now, this is not a sales pitch for CCLA's deposit fund. There are other ones out there, but just to give you an example, because we're not a bank, we can just pay forward to you, the investor, the interest that we get within the fund, and that allows us to broadly track base rates over time. So that shows you that you can still get sort of somewhere between 4 and 5% on your cash without having to lock it up, which could be potentially helpful to you if you hold cash. So, you know, as I said, this is not a sales pitch, but just to give you an example, and this will be similar for other money market funds that you might look at. CCLA's fund is structured as a charity, as in and of itself. It's AAA rated, so focus on security, the return of your money before the return on your money. And as I said, very well diversified. And because it's so big, the fund is £1.8 billion in size. We can put money out over, you know, a month, 6 months, a year to maximize the returns that we get on it. But it's still very liquid for you, the investor. And of course, there's no minimum or maximum or limits on how many transactions or how many times you can come in and out. It's super flexible, and the minimum investment is £1. So it really is designed for charities regardless of their size. But as I said, just an example, there are other ones out there to look at. So that's the short-term bit. If you only have cash, are you doing enough with your cash? You know, are you getting enough return on it? Are you being strategic with it? If you were to think about longer term investments, and just what do we mean by long-term investments? In our world, we mean, you know, are there reserves that you could put away or at least consider putting away for sort of 5 to 10 years? And the reason that we say that is, you know, you need to be able to, accept a certain amount of volatility in order to gain reward over time. And I'll come on to that in a moment. So with longer term investments, we need to think about what the greatest risks are. And you may well have trustees or executives that say, we cannot take any volatility risk. We can't have our £100 being any less than £100 at any time, in which case long-term investments may not be for you. But if you can take a longer term approach, then you might think about other risks that are relevant to your organization. But as I said before, you need to be clear about what the money's for, what does it need to do for your organization, and when. So if you're clear on the objectives, we have this money, it's designed as a rainy day fund that we don't intend to spend for 5 years or more. Therefore, what are the greatest risks to achieving that objective? It might be that you cannot accept any volatility risk, as I said, so how much your investments go up and down in value. But it might be that actually over time, inflation's your biggest risk. So if you remain in cash for 10 years, your cash is just losing value against inflation. Your purchasing power with that cash won't be maintained. But of course, there are other risks like reputational risk. Are there things that you would not want to invest in that your stakeholders would feel very strongly about? So it's really important that you think about the risks that are most relevant to your organization and your objectives, because we focus very much as individuals. I think it's human nature that we focus on loss more than we focus on gain. So we're very worried about volatility, whereas actually in the long term, inflation is by far the greater risk if you are a long-term investor. So to sort of give you a few examples as to how this kind of plays out and the risks that your organization might be willing to take, this chart just shows the different asset classes and how they've performed over the last 12 months. So global equities, company shares listed around the world in light blue at the top there, performed very strongly in 2024. You've got property as the sort of stepped ladder in green. You've got cash in grey, bonds in dark blue, and inflation in red. So if you were a charity with only short-term objectives, you're going to spend the money sometime soon, or you have a reserves policy that say you need to keep a certain sum held in cash, then clearly investing in company shares or equities, that top blue line, in, say, June of 2024, and then spending the money in, say, July, clearly would have been a very high risk and costly strategy. In this scenario, volatility might well be your greatest risk, and investment in lower volatility asset classes might be more appropriate. So if you're likely to spend the money within a year, or perhaps 2, then cash is typically the only asset class where you can be sure that a pound remains a pound when you need to spend it. If, however, you do have some money that you're unlikely to spend over the longer term, or you want to commit to not spending it to build financial resilience, then as I said, holding cash could be pretty high risk because you're going to be losing your purchasing power against inflation over the time period. So this chart shows the same asset classes in the same colors, but over a 10-year period. So you might see the yellow circle there. So if you'd held cash in grey, it would have not kept pace with inflation, clearly. So if you'd invested £100, it would have turned into £113 over a 10-year period. But to keep pace with inflation, your £100 would need to have turned into £135 over 10 years. So again, in this case, inflation is your biggest risk. But if you're a long-term investor and you'd been invested in global equities, company shares, whilst it would have been a very bumpy ride, especially you can see COVID there in 2020, you would have been rewarded for your patience. So your £100 would have turned into £321, well ahead of inflation. So most charities who can afford to take a long-term view with some of their assets tend to invest in a multi-asset fund where they have exposure both to equities to get that long-term return, but also to control some of the volatility by investing in things like property, alternatives like infrastructure and renewable energy, and then a bit of bonds and cash to sort of balance out the returns of global equities. So this multi-asset approach has historically meant that returns are not as high as pure equity exposure, but the lows are also not as low. So in our experience, this is where most charities tend to invest for the long term. They have a multi-asset fund with some global equities or a high proportion of global equities to protect you from inflation, but also some of those other asset classes to balance out that volatility risk. And again, very happy to talk to any of you about how we look after long-term investments at CCLA as well. So bringing this all together, how might you create financial resilience in your organization? Firstly, you could review your current situation. Are your assets serving and supporting your organization? And just sharing again that lesson, lessons learned from COVID. Is there anything you could have done differently? You could write an investment policy, and again, happy to share guides, but just be clear about how short-term and long-term reserves might be incorporated into that policy to create stability and resilience, and test it with the £1 million donation idea. Are you all clear on what you would do? And then finally, ask for guidance. There's a lot of help out there to support financial resilience. There's CCLA, and I'm here in Edinburgh, very happy to help. The SCVO have lots of resources, OSCAR, SIPFA, do ask for help. And that's where I will pause and hand over to you for questions and discussion.
Thanks, Celia.